Before the flood ever came, God sent one angel to fight a war heaven never talks about. Not against Satan, against giants. Why did Scripture bury this battle? And what was so dangerous that Michael himself was ordered to end it? Long before the rains fell on Noah's world, the ground itself was groaning under something unnatural. Genesis 6:4 tells us plainly, there were giants in the earth in those days. Not myth, not metaphor. A historical claim, sitting quietly in the first book of the Bible, waiting for someone to actually take it seriously. Most people read that verse and move on. They shouldn't, because what happened next in that ancient world was so violent, so contrary to the order God had spoken into creation, that heaven itself intervened directly, not through a prophet, not through a plague, through an archangel sent with a mission most churches never preach about. His name was Michael. We know Michael as the warrior angel, the one who cast down the dragon in Revelation 12. But centuries before that final battle, Michael was already fighting a war few congregations have ever heard described from the pulpit. The Book of Enoch, a text the earliest Jewish and Christian communities knew well, even quoted directly in the New Testament in Jude 1:14-15, describes a rebellion in heaven that most modern readers have simply never been told about. A group of angels called the Watchers looked down at the daughters of men and desired them. Genesis 6:2 confirms it in a single haunting line. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. This wasn't a poetic flourish tucked into ancient Hebrew literature. This was celestial beings crossing a boundary they were never meant to cross, and the consequences reached far beyond themselves. And the offspring of that union were not ordinary children. Enoch 7 describes them growing at an unnatural rate, consuming everything around them, the harvest, the livestock, and eventually turning to devour human beings themselves. These were the Nephilim, giants in stature and, according to the ancient texts, monstrous in appetite and violence, until the land could no longer sustain what had been unleashed upon it. Think about what that actually means for a moment. The earth was being consumed by beings that were never supposed to exist in the first place. Creation itself was unraveling from the inside out. And God, watching a world spiral into something unrecognizable, didn't simply wait for the flood to solve the problem on its own. He sent someone first, someone with the authority to confront the source directly. Enoch 10 records the divine command with startling specificity. God speaks to Michael directly and says, "Go, Michael, bind Semjaza and his associates who have united themselves with women so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness." Semjaza was the leader of the Watchers, the one who convinced 200 angels to descend onto Mount Hermon and break the created order they had once been bound to uphold. This is the war the Bible barely whispers about, a spiritual conflict fought before the physical flood ever came. Michael wasn't simply told to fight the Nephilim's physical bodies on the ground. He was ordered to bind the angels standing behind them, the architects of the corruption itself, the ones who had opened the door in the first place. Why does this matter for us now, thousands of years later? Because the pattern in this account isn't just an ancient curiosity buried in obscure texts. It reveals something about how evil actually enters a world. It rarely announces itself as evil outright. It arrives disguised as desire, as knowledge, as something that looks appealing on the surface and promises more than it can honestly give. The Watchers didn't descend looking like monsters. They descended as beings offering forbidden knowledge. Enoch 8 lists metallurgy, cosmetics, sorcery, and the art of war among the secrets they taught humanity. Knowledge handed over without wisdom, without boundaries, without God's timing behind it. Sound familiar? Job 1.6 tells us that the sons of God, the same phrase used for these Watchers, came to present themselves before the Lord, meaning these were beings with real access to heaven's counsel, not distant creatures from folklore or borrowed mythology. That's what makes this account so unsettling once you sit with it. This wasn't rebellion arriving from outside the gates. It was betrayal from within the ranks closest to the throne itself, and Michael's task was not small. He was being sent to correct a corruption already spreading across the whole earth, one that Genesis 6:5 says had made every imagination of the thoughts of his heart turn continually toward evil. The Nephilim bloodline had polluted humanity to the point where God saw only one family, Noah's, left untouched by it. This is why the flood came. Not merely because people sinned in ordinary everyday ways. Something deeper, something genetic and spiritual, had corrupted the created order at its very root. And before water ever covered the earth, Michael was already moving through the spiritual realm, binding the watchers in chains of darkness according to Enoch 10:12, reserved until the day of their judgment. What we're looking at here is not a side story tucked into forgotten scrolls. It's the hidden scaffolding behind one of the most catastrophic events described in all of Scripture. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every mention of giants in the land, every strange reference to the Anakim, the Rephaim, the sons of Anak that Israel would later encounter in Canaan, all trace back to this single moment. A war fought in heaven and on earth before a single drop of rain ever fell. We're going to walk through exactly how this rebellion started, what the Watchers actually taught humanity, and how Michael carried out an assignment that reshaped the ancient world. Details most people have never once heard preached from a pulpit, yet sit right there in Scripture and the text that surrounded it. If your church never covered this, you're not alone. And that's exactly why this channel exists. If these forgotten accounts are stirring something in you, go ahead and subscribe right now, because we're uncovering these buried truths every single week, piece by piece, layer by layer. And if you want to go even deeper than any single video can take you, our premium illustrated biblical mystery guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, is waiting for you. It walks through every layer of this account, the Watchers, the Nephilim bloodlines, the world before the flood, with full illustrations that bring these ancient events to life in a way words alone simply cannot. It's the kind of guide you'll find yourself returning to again and again, especially once you realize how much of Scripture actually connects back to it. The link is pinned in the first comment below. If this story is resonating with you, that guide is exactly where your next step should be. 200 angels made a decision on top of a mountain that would break the world beneath them. Enoch 6 names the place directly, Mount Hermon, a peak straddling the border of modern Lebanon and Syria, still standing today, still snow-capped, still ordinary to anyone who doesn't know what happened there. But in the ancient account, it was the site of an oath. Semjaza, the leader among them, was afraid to act alone. Enoch 6:3-4 records him gathering the others and saying, "I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin." So they bound themselves together with a mutual curse, 200 strong, and descended in the days of Jared, a name that itself carries weight, since Jared means descent in Hebrew, as if the very naming of that generation foretold what was coming. This wasn't a spontaneous fall. It was calculated, deliberate, a collective agreement among beings who understood exactly what they were forfeiting and chose to do it anyway. Once they descended, the corruption didn't stop with marriage and offspring. Enoch 8 lists what came next, and it reads less like ancient poetry and more like a catalogue of civilization's darker inventions arriving all at once, centuries before humanity was ready for any of it. Azazel, one of the chief watchers, taught men how to forge swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, the tools of organized warfare, where before there had only been conflict on a smaller, more human scale. He taught women the art of deception through beauty, the working of metals into bracelets and ornaments, the use of antimony to darken the eyes, the staining of the eyebrows, precious stones and dyes. Vanity and violence introduced in the same breath. Other watchers spread different knowledge. Enoch 8:3 names them one by one. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings, Amaros the resolving of enchantments, Archangel taught astrology, Kokabel the constellations, Ezekiel the knowledge of the clouds. On the surface, some of this sounds harmless, even useful, astronomy, botany, metallurgy. But the text is clear that this knowledge was given prematurely, outside of God's intended order, without the moral maturity to carry it responsibly. Isaiah 14:12-14 echoes this same pattern of pride. A created being reaching for what belonged to the Creator alone, wanting to ascend above the heights of the clouds and be like the Most High. That's the real danger buried in this account, and it's worth sitting with. Knowledge itself was never the sin. The sin was taking what God had not yet released, on a timeline that wasn't his, through means that bypassed his authority entirely. It's the same temptation offered in Eden. Ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Just repackaged for a different generation, dressed in new language, arriving through different messengers. And the consequences spread fast. Enoch 7-3-5 describes the Nephilim turning against humanity itself, once the natural food supply couldn't sustain their appetite. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. This is graphic, deliberately so, because the ancient writer wanted his audience to understand the scale of what had gone wrong. This wasn't a minor social problem. It was an ecological and moral collapse, spreading outward from a handful of angelic decisions made on a mountaintop. The cry of the earth itself is described as reaching heaven. Enoch 8:4 says, "The earth made the accusation against the lawless ones." Genesis 4:10 uses nearly identical imagery generations earlier, when Abel's blood cried out from the ground after Cain killed him. There's a consistent pattern in Scripture, where violence and injustice don't simply disappear once committed. They leave a mark, a testimony, a cry that reaches the throne of God, whether anyone intended for it to be heard or not. 4 archangels are named as witnesses to this cry: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Suriel, according to Enoch 9. They looked down at the bloodshed covering the earth and brought the matter directly before God, described in Enoch 9:1-3 as pleading on behalf of humanity, asking why the world had been allowed to descend into such chaos. This is a striking detail most people never encounter. Angels interceding for mankind, appalled at what other angels had done, standing as advocates before the throne long before any human prophet raised his voice in protest. God's response was immediate and specific. Each archangel received a distinct assignment tied to undoing what the Watchers had done. Raphael was sent to bind Azazel, the one who had taught mankind the making of weapons, and to cast him into darkness in the desert, according to Enoch 10:4-6. Gabriel was sent against the Nephilim themselves, to set them against one another in mutual destruction, according to Enoch 10:9-10. And Michael, the one this entire account centers on, was given the heaviest task of all, binding Semjaza and the entire company of Watchers who had defiled themselves with humanity, holding them until the appointed day of judgment. This wasn't a single battle. It was a coordinated, multi-front intervention, orchestrated directly by God and carried out by 4 of his highest-ranking angels simultaneously. And it happened before the flood, before Noah ever received instructions to build an ark, before a single drop of rain touched the ground. What we're seeing here is the anatomy of a rebellion, how it started with a handful of beings making a private decision on a mountain, how it spread through knowledge given without wisdom, how it corrupted an entire civilization within a matter of generations, and how heaven responded not with silence, but with direct, targeted intervention. The war Michael fought wasn't abstract. It had names, locations, timelines, and consequences that rippled forward into the very bloodlines Israel would later encounter when they entered the Promised Land, generations after the flood had already come and gone. There's something almost unbearable about the detail in these accounts, the specificity of it. This wasn't a vague cosmic struggle described in broad strokes. It was a rebellion with an origin point on an actual mountain, with named leaders, with a documented list of forbidden knowledge, with 4 archangels standing before God's throne pleading a case on behalf of a dying world. Scripture and the texts surrounding it treat this as history, not allegory. Jude, writing under inspiration in the New Testament, didn't quote Enoch as a courtesy. He quoted it because the early church understood these events as part of the real, unfolding story of a world in open rebellion against its creator, long before the flood ever came to reset it. And that's exactly why Michael's assignment matters so much. God didn't respond to this corruption by simply erasing everyone involved without explanation. He sent a messenger first, an enforcer of divine order, someone tasked with confronting the source of the corruption directly, rather than only its consequences. That distinction says something about how God operates even in judgment, dealing first with the architects of a rebellion, and only afterward with the flood that would cleanse what remained. The method God chose for Michael's mission wasn't a sword fight in the clouds. It was something closer to an arrest, deliberate, restrained, and permanent. Enoch 10:11-12 records the exact wording of the divine order. Bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated. Not destroyed, not annihilated on the spot, bound, held, reserved for a reckoning that hadn't arrived yet. That detail alone should stop us for a moment. God could have ended Semjaza and his company instantly. He had every right to. Instead, Michael's assignment was containment, not annihilation, a choice that tells us something about how divine justice actually operates. Judgment on this scale isn't rushed, it's measured, patient, and ultimately certain, even when it takes what looks to human eyes like an unbearably long time to unfold. Jude 1-6 confirms this same detail centuries later in the New Testament, describing angels who kept not their first estate but left their own habitation as being reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Two texts, written centuries apart, describing the identical outcome, not a battle that ended quickly, but a binding that stretches across the whole of human history, waiting for a final resolution still to come. Where exactly did this binding take place? Enoch 10:4-5 names a location for Azazel specifically, a desert called Dudael, where Raphael was instructed to dig a hole, cast him in, and cover him with rough and jagged rocks, leaving him in darkness. For Semjaza and the rest of the company under Michael's charge, the language shifts slightly, but the imagery remains consistent throughout the text. Valleys, pits, chains, darkness. Not open combat in the sky, but confinement beneath the earth itself in places human eyes were never meant to see. There's a haunting symmetry here worth noticing. The Watchers had descended from the heights of heaven to walk among men. Now they were being driven downward again, this time beneath the earth, sealed away from both the realm they'd abandoned and the world they'd corrupted. A fall within a fall. Isaiah 14:15 uses almost identical language for a different rebellious figure entirely, describing someone who sought to ascend above the clouds, instead being brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. The pattern repeats throughout Scripture, pride reaching upward, judgment answering downward. But Michael's task didn't end with binding the angels. Enoch 10:16-17 also assigns a cleansing role tied to his mission, clearing the earth of the violence and corruption the Watchers had unleashed, so that righteousness could take root again, however briefly, before the flood came to finish what Michael's intervention had started. This wasn't only an act of restraint against rebellious angels, it was preparation, groundwork laid for the judgment still to come through Noah. And that timing matters more than it might seem at first glance. Michael's binding of the Watchers happened before the flood, not after. Which means by the time Noah received his instructions to build the ark in Genesis 6:14, the spiritual source of the corruption had already been dealt with. What remained on the earth, the physical Nephilim, the corrupted bloodlines, the violence Genesis 6:11 describes as filling the entire earth, that's what the flood was sent to address. Two judgments working in sequence, one spiritual carried out by an archangel, one physical carried out through water. This raises an uncomfortable question many teachers avoid entirely. If Michael bound the Watchers and cleared the immediate threat, why did the Nephilim bloodline apparently continue after the flood? Numbers 13:33 describes the spies Moses sent into Canaan, returning with a report of giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. Generations after the flood had supposedly wiped the earth clean. Deuteronomy 3:11 references Og, king of Bashan, described as of the remnant of giants, his bed measuring 9 cubits in length. Something survived, or something returned. Ancient Jewish tradition offers a few explanations, though none are stated with total certainty in the earliest texts. Some accounts suggest a second, smaller incursion of Watchers occurred after the flood. Others point to the wives of Noah's sons as a possible avenue for corrupted bloodlines to persist unnoticed. What remains consistent across the sources, though, is this. The war Michael fought before the flood wasn't the final chapter. It was the first major intervention in a much longer conflict that Israel would inherit generations later, fighting literal descendants of that same corrupted lineage as they entered the Promised Land. That's a detail worth sitting with. When Joshua and the Israelites faced the Anakim in Canaan, when David faced Goliath, himself connected by many ancient traditions to this same giant lineage, they weren't just fighting oversized enemies. They were confronting the remnant of a rebellion that began on a mountain, was addressed by an archangel, and was never fully eradicated, only restrained and pushed back, generation after generation. Even the instruction God gave Israel regarding certain nations in Canaan, the command to leave nothing breathing in specific cities described in Deuteronomy 20:16-17, reads differently once you understand what bloodlines those cities may have carried. This wasn't ordinary warfare between tribes. In more than one instance, it was the continuation of a much older conflict, one that started long before Abraham was ever called out of Ur. And it's worth remembering that Michael himself doesn't disappear from this story after Enoch's account ends. Daniel 10:13 describes him as a prince, a title suggesting authority over a specific domain rather than a general assignment. Daniel 12:1 goes further, calling him the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, positioned as a guardian specifically over Israel during times of tribulation. The same angel sent to bind the watchers before the flood is the one Scripture later describes standing watch over God's people through their darkest national moments. A continuity that spans thousands of years within the same unfolding account. Michael's war, then, wasn't a single closed event tucked away in the pages of an obscure apocryphal book. It was the opening act of a conflict that echoes forward through the rest of Scripture, through Canaan, through the monarchy, all the way to Revelation 12, where the same archangel stands again, this time casting down the dragon itself in a final confrontation that mirrors the very first one he was ever sent to fight. The question worth asking now isn't whether this war actually happened. The texts are consistent, layered, and cross-referenced across centuries of Jewish and early Christian tradition. The real question is what it means that God chose restraint over annihilation, containment over destruction, and what that says about the judgment still described as waiting, even now, for a day that hasn't yet arrived. There's a phrase in Matthew 24:37 that most people read past without stopping. Jesus, speaking directly to his disciples about the last days, says, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Not a passing comparison, a direct warning spoken by Christ himself, tying the conditions before the flood to conditions that would return before his own return. If Michael's war against the Watchers was simply a strange footnote in ancient history, why would Jesus use that exact era as his reference point for the end of the age? That question sits at the center of what makes this account so much more than apocryphal curiosity. 2 Peter 2:4-5 draws the same connection, describing God who spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, in the same breath as his judgment on the old world through the flood. Peter isn't separating these events. He's linking them directly, treating the fallen watchers and the flood as two parts of a single unfolding judgment. So if the days of Noah are the template for the end times, it's worth asking honestly what those days actually contained. Not simply moral decline in a general sense. Scripture is specific about what filled the earth. Genesis 6:11 says, "The earth was filled with violence," not disagreement, not ordinary sin. Violence on a scale severe enough to warrant the complete undoing of a world through water. And behind that violence, according to both Genesis and Enoch, stood the Nephilim, beings whose very existence was a direct product of angelic rebellion. This is where the post-flood record becomes impossible to ignore. If the flood was meant to cleanse the earth of this corruption entirely, the Bible itself tells us it didn't fully succeed. Numbers 13:33 records the spies returning from Canaan, terrified, reporting, "We saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers." Genesis 6:4 itself contains the detail most people skip past entirely, that the Nephilim were on the earth, and also after that, meaning after the flood as well as before it. The text doesn't hide this. It states it plainly, almost as an aside, as if expecting the reader to already understand the implications. Deuteronomy 2:11 and 2:20 identify the Rephaim, the Emim, and the Zamzumim as related giant peoples scattered across the region east of the Jordan, each described with the same unsettling detail: tall, feared, remembered by name generations after they should have been erased. And then there's Og, king of Bashan, described in Deuteronomy 3:11 with a bed measuring 9 cubits by 4 cubits, somewhere close to 13 feet by 6 feet, by most calculations. Whatever margin of legend may have crept into that number over centuries of retelling, the underlying claim is unmistakable. Something enormous, something the text insists on remembering specifically, ruled that region until Israel confronted it directly. David's confrontation with Goliath in 1 Samuel 17 fits this same pattern, though it's often taught in isolation, disconnected from the larger account behind it. Goliath is described as being from Gath, one of the cities the text associates with the remnant of these giant bloodlines in 2 Samuel 21:22, where 4 additional giants, all described as descendants of the same lineage, are named individually and defeated one by David's mightiest men. This wasn't a single, isolated encounter. It was one battle in a much longer campaign against a bloodline that had never been fully removed from the land, despite everything that had already happened before the flood. And this is where the ancient world outside of Scripture becomes strangely relevant. Sites like Baalbek in modern Lebanon feature foundation stones weighing well over 1,000 tons each, quarried and moved with precision that still puzzles engineers today. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey has been dated to roughly 9600 BC, predating what conventional history considered possible for organized construction on that scale. Built by people the mainstream timeline says shouldn't have possessed that level of coordination yet. None of this proves the Nephilim built these structures, but it raises an honest question worth asking rather than dismissing outright. If beings with knowledge beyond their era genuinely walked the earth before and after the flood, would we expect the physical record to look any different than what we're actually finding at sites like these? This is precisely why Michael's War matters, for understanding the end times, not just ancient history. If Jesus pointed directly to the days of Noah as the pattern for what's coming, and if those days were defined by corrupted knowledge, violence born from angelic rebellion, and bloodlines that persisted well beyond the flood meant to end them, then the return of similar conditions isn't a metaphor. It's a specific, textually grounded expectation. Revelation 12:7 describes a final battle where Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, language that deliberately echoes his earlier assignment against Semjaza and the Watchers centuries before. The same Archangel, a different chapter of the same ongoing conflict. What began on Mount Hermon with 200 angels breaking their created boundaries doesn't end with Noah's flood. It continues, according to Scripture's own internal logic, all the way through to Revelation, where Michael stands once more at the center of a war between heaven and the forces that first rebelled against it. There's something worth pausing on here, because it changes how you read the rest of the Old Testament once you see it. Every time Israel encountered a fortified city guarded by an oversized enemy, every time a prophet warned about corruption spreading through knowledge given outside of God's order, every time Scripture mentions a remnant of something ancient still lingering in the land, these aren't isolated incidents scattered randomly across different books. They're threads of the same story, connected by a single unresolved conflict that started before the flood and never received its final resolution within the pages of the Old Testament itself. That's precisely why Revelation matters so much as the closing bracket to this account. Michael isn't introduced there as a new character. He's brought back as the same figure readers of Enoch and Genesis would already recognize, the enforcer sent to confront rebellion at its source, appearing again exactly when that rebellion reaches its final, most desperate stage. Understanding what happened before the flood isn't simply about satisfying curiosity over ancient giants. It's about recognizing a pattern Christ himself said would repeat, and understanding what that repetition might actually mean for the world we're living in right now, in a generation that increasingly resembles the one Genesis describes just before the waters came. Daniel 12:1 contains a detail that deserves far more attention than it usually receives. Speaking of the end times, the text says, "And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation even to that same time." The same archangel sent to bind the watchers before the flood is described here as rising again, at a future point, during a period of trouble unlike anything recorded in human history up to that moment. That's not a small claim. That's scripture, placing Michael at both the beginning and the climax of the same extended conflict. What makes this pattern so unsettling is how closely the conditions described for the end times mirror what happened before the flood. Genesis 6:5 describes a world where every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Not occasional evil, not isolated corruption. A saturation point where the moral fabric of an entire civilization had been overtaken. 2 Timothy 3:1-4 describes a similar saturation for the last days. People described as lovers of themselves, boastful, proud, without natural affection, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. Different language, same underlying condition. A world that has drifted so far from its created order that intervention becomes the only remaining option. And then there's the matter of forbidden knowledge, which Enoch treats as central to the corruption before the flood. Azazel taught weapons of war, others taught sorcery, enchantments, and secrets that reshaped how humanity related to the created world around it. Daniel 12:4, in the same chapter that names Michael's future rising, contains a striking companion prophecy: "Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." Some readers dismiss this as a simple statement about travel and education, advancing over centuries. But placed directly beside a prophecy about Michael's return during the worst period of trouble the world has ever known, it reads differently. An explosion of knowledge arriving faster than human wisdom can responsibly contain it, echoing the exact pattern that preceded the flood in the first place. We're not meant to draw wild speculation from this, but the parallel is difficult to ignore for anyone paying attention to the pace of change in the world around us. Knowledge that once took centuries to develop now compounds in years, sometimes months. Boundaries that once felt permanent around what should and shouldn't be altered, created, or engineered are being tested and crossed at a speed no previous generation has faced. If the days of Noah truly are the template Christ pointed to in Matthew 24, then a generation defined by knowledge outpacing wisdom is exactly the kind of generation Scripture warned us to watch for. This is also where the Watcher's original sin becomes relevant again, in a way that goes beyond ancient history. Their transgression wasn't simply supernatural beings mingling with humans, though that alone violated the created order in a profound way. It was the transfer of knowledge and power outside of God's timing, given to beings who lacked the spiritual maturity to steward it. Job 38:4-7 records God's own response to Job, asking where he was when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy at creation, a reminder that even angelic beings exist within boundaries set by their Creator, boundaries the Watchers chose to abandon entirely. Ephesians 6:12 tells us plainly that we wrestle not against flesh and blood but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. That verse, written by Paul centuries after Michael's mission against the Watchers, describes the same category of conflict, not human enemies, but spiritual authorities operating behind the visible world, the same kind of authority Semjaza and his company once held before their rebellion stripped it from them. This is precisely why understanding Michael's war before the flood isn't optional background information for anyone trying to make sense of the end times described later in Scripture. It's the origin point of the entire conflict. The rebellion that started on Mount Hermon didn't end when Michael bound Semjaza in chains of darkness. It was paused, restrained, held for judgment. And Scripture consistently describes that judgment as still pending, still waiting for its final chapter, right up through Revelation 21:3, where an angel binds the dragon itself with a great chain for 1,000 years, using language that deliberately echoes the very binding Michael carried out against the Watchers thousands of years earlier. 2 bindings, 2 archangels, the same pattern repeating across the entire span of biblical history, from before the flood to the very end of the age. That's not coincidence. That's a deliberate thread woven through Scripture by a God who doesn't waste details, who doesn't include ancient accounts of angelic rebellion simply to fill space in obscure texts, but who consistently shows his people the shape of a conflict that started long before recorded history and won't fully conclude until Michael rises one final time, exactly as Daniel described. Understanding this doesn't just satisfy curiosity about giants and fallen angels, it reframes how we read the rest of Scripture entirely. Every mention of ancient bloodlines, every warning about the last days, every reference to Michael standing watch over God's people, all connected back to a single moment when God chose to send one archangel to confront a rebellion that had already begun consuming the world he created. There's a reason this account was preserved, copied and passed down for thousands of years, even outside the boundaries of the canon most churches recognize today. The early church didn't treat Enoch as fiction. Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century, defended the book's authenticity specifically because Jude quoted it directly. Jewish communities at Qumran, the same community responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserved multiple copies of Enoch alongside their copies of Isaiah and the Psalms, treating it as valuable enough to protect during centuries of upheaval. This wasn't a fringe text circulating on the margins of belief. It sat close to the center of how ancient believers understood the unseen conflict shaping the visible world around them. And that's ultimately what this entire account offers anyone willing to look past the surface-level Sunday school version of Genesis 6. Not a replacement for Scripture, but a deeper window into what Scripture itself already claims happened. A war fought before the flood, an archangel sent to bind what threatened to consume creation, and a pattern that Christ himself pointed back to when describing the very last days of human history. Thank you for walking through this with us. Stories like Michael's war before the flood are exactly why this channel exists, pulling forgotten truths out of Scripture back into the light where they belong. If this account moved something in you, subscribe, hit like, and drop a comment telling us what stood out most. It genuinely helps this channel keep uncovering what institutional teaching so often leaves out. And before you go, our premium illustrated biblical mystery guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, takes everything we covered today so much further, with full illustrations bringing the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the world before the flood to life. The link is pinned in the first comment. If today's video stirred something in you, that guide is where the next part of this journey continues. More forgotten truths are waiting on your screen right now.